How did America's first chocolate chip cookie come to exist through pure accident? Was it a moment of inspired creativity, careful experimentation, or just a busy cook making do with whatever was handy? And why did this particular mistake become the blueprint for every lunchbox treat that followed? Actually, you might be surprised to learn that the chocolate chip cookie almost didn't happen at all. If Ruth Wakefield had been better organized that day, we might all be dunking something completely different in our milk. Stay with me tonight, and you'll learn how one busy afternoon, a missing ingredient, and a woman's practical problem-solving created the chocolate chip cookie that would define childhood for generations. Perhaps, as we trace this sweet accident through time, you'll find something gentle to occupy your thoughts, something warm and familiar to carry you toward rest. When you think about supporting more stories like this one, maybe hit that subscribe button, no pressure, just if tonight's tale feels like the kind of thing you'd want to hear again. And drop a comment below. Tell me what your favorite kind of cookie is, or whether you're the type who bakes from scratch or reaches for the pre-made dough. I'm genuinely curious about the cookie preferences of people listening at this hour. Now, settle back into your pillows. Maybe adjust that blanket just so. Let your breathing find its natural rhythm, and picture yourself stepping back in time to a place where the smell of fresh baking was about to change everything. You're standing outside the Toll House Inn on a crisp autumn day in 1930, and the first thing you notice is how perfectly ordinary it looks. This isn't some grand hotel or fancy restaurant. It's just a comfortable roadside inn nestled along Route 18 in Whitman, Massachusetts. The kind of place where weary travelers stop for a good meal and a clean bed. The building itself, well, it has history. Built back in 1709. It actually served as a toll house during colonial times, hence the name. Travelers heading between New Bedford and Boston would stop here to pay their road fees, grab a bite, maybe water their horses. By the time you're observing it, the horses are long gone, replaced by the steady hum of automobiles. But that sense of being a way station for tired travelers, that remains exactly the same. What makes this place special isn't the building, it's what's happening inside. The new owners. Ruth and Kenneth Wakefield have transformed this old toll house into something remarkable. Ruth, she's not just any innkeeper. She's got a degree in household arts from Framingham State Teachers College. She's taught home economics, written a cookbook, and she approaches cooking with the methodical precision of someone who actually understands the science behind what she's doing. You can hear her in the kitchen even from outside, the gentle clatter of mixing bowls, the soft thud of dough being kneaded, the satisfied hum of someone completely in her element. Ruth has built quite a reputation already. Travelers detoured just to taste her cooking, especially her desserts. She's particularly famous for her butterscotch cookies, which she serves warm with vanilla ice cream. Honestly, I can almost smell them from here. That rich caramel sweetness that makes your mouth water before you even take a bite. The inn's dining room, when you peek through the windows, has that warm, lived in feeling that only comes from genuine hospitality. Checkered tablecloths, fresh flowers, the kind of place where strangers become friends over coffee and pie. Kenneth handles the business side, greeting guests, managing reservations, but Ruth is the heart of the operation. Her food has already earned mentions in travel guides. People drive hours just to taste what she's creating in that kitchen. What strikes you most, standing here in 1930, is how this represents something uniquely American. Here's this colonial building, steeped in 3 centuries of history, being transformed by the vision of a modern, educated woman who sees cooking not as drudgery, but as craft. Ruth brings scientific precision to traditional recipes. She experiments. She innovates. She's not content to just follow what her grandmother did. The location itself tells a story about America in transition. Route 18 is becoming increasingly busy as more families own automobiles. Weekend drives are becoming a national pastime, and places like the Toll House Inn are perfectly positioned to serve this new mobile society. People are traveling more, exploring more, and they want authentic experiences, not just assembly line food. You notice, watching the steady stream of visitors, that Ruth has tapped into something deeper than just hunger. She's offering a kind of comfort, a taste of home-cooked goodness in an increasingly industrialized world. Her guests don't just eat and leave. They linger, they chat, they ask for recipes. There's something about Ruth's approach to cooking that makes people feel cared for, and that's rarer than you might think. The kitchen, if you could see inside, is Ruth's laboratory. She's constantly tweaking recipes, trying new combinations, approaching each dish like a puzzle to be solved. She keeps detailed notes, measures precisely, understands how altitude and humidity affect her baking. This isn't accidental success. It's the result of genuine expertise and relentless attention to detail. Some food historians argue about whether Ruth was truly the innovator she appeared to be, or whether she was simply the first to document and popularize techniques that other cooks had been using informally. But standing here, watching her work, seeing the care she puts into every detail, you get the sense that originality isn't always about inventing something completely new. Sometimes it's about perfecting something familiar until it becomes extraordinary. The Toll House Inn in 1930 represents a perfect storm of circumstances. The right person, in the right place, with the right skills, at exactly the right moment in American history. Ruth doesn't know it yet, but she's positioned to create something that will outlast the inn itself, outlast the highway that brings her customers, outlast even her own lifetime. As you stand there, breathing in the aroma of fresh bread and roasting chicken, you can't help but feel that you're witnessing the calm before a very sweet storm. Ruth Wakefield herself, now she's someone worth understanding better, because the woman who would accidentally create America's most beloved cookie wasn't just any ordinary innkeeper. Born Ruth Jones Graves in East Walpole, Massachusetts in 1903, she approached life with the same methodical precision she brought to her kitchen, always questioning, always improving, never quite satisfied with good enough. You have to picture Ruth in her element, moving through the Toll House kitchen at dawn, checking supplies with the efficiency of someone who's turned organization into an art form. She's not just cooking, she's conducting a symphony of flavors, timing each dish so that everything emerges from her ovens at precisely the right moment. This isn't luck. This is the result of formal training at Framingham State Teachers College, where she studied household arts with the seriousness of a medical student. What made Ruth different from other cooks of her era wasn't just her education, it was her attitude. She treated every recipe like a scientific experiment, keeping detailed notes on what worked, what didn't, and why. When she served her famous butterscotch cookies warm with vanilla ice cream, it wasn't because that's how her grandmother did it. It was because she'd tested the combination multiple times and understood exactly how the temperature contrast enhanced both flavors. The daily rhythm at the Toll House revealed Ruth's true personality. She'd rise before the sun, not out of obligation, but out of genuine excitement for the day ahead. You can imagine her in those quiet morning hours, flour dusting her apron, mentally rehearsing the day's menu while her hands worked almost automatically, kneading bread dough with the confidence that comes from years of practice. Her relationship with guests went far beyond simple hospitality. Ruth remembered names, asked about children, noticed when someone seemed particularly stressed or tired. She had this uncanny ability to read people's moods and adjust her service accordingly. A businessman rushing through might get his coffee extra hot and his breakfast extra fast, while a young couple on their honeymoon might find an extra dollop of whipped cream on their pie, just because. What I find fascinating about Ruth is how she balanced her scientific approach with genuine intuition. She could tell you the exact temperature needed for perfect caramelization, but she could also sense when a guest needed extra attention. This combination of technical skill and emotional intelligence, it's what separated her from other cooks, and it's probably what made her so willing to experiment when faced with unexpected challenges. The Toll House's success wasn't accidental. It was the direct result of Ruth's relentless attention to detail. She sourced the best ingredients she could afford, often driving to farms herself to inspect produce, negotiating with suppliers until she got exactly what she wanted. Her ice cream was made fresh daily, her bread baked in small batches throughout the day, her vegetables picked that morning from her own garden when possible. But here's where Ruth's personality becomes crucial to our story. She was incredibly practical. When faced with a problem, she didn't panic, she adapted. If a supplier was late, she found an alternative. If equipment broke, she worked around it. If she ran out of an ingredient mid-recipe, well, she'd figure something out. This pragmatic approach to problem solving, this willingness to improvise, this is what would make all the difference on one particular afternoon in 1938. Ruth's customers often commented on how relaxed they felt at the inn, not just because of the comfortable rooms or the excellent food, but because of Ruth herself. She had this way of making people feel like they were visiting a favorite aunt, someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. Guests would linger over coffee, share stories, ask for recipe advice, and Ruth would listen with the patience of someone who understood that good hospitality is about more than just good food. There's a telling detail about Ruth that reveals her character. She kept a suggestion book where guests could leave comments about their stay. Most innkeepers might have used this for marketing purposes, but Ruth used it as a research tool. She'd study every comment, looking for patterns, identifying areas for improvement, always seeking ways to make the next guest's experience even better. Some culinary historians question whether Ruth's later fame was truly deserved, suggesting that many cooks of her era were equally skilled and innovative, but perhaps less fortunate in their timing and circumstances. Others argue that Ruth's scientific background and methodical approach to recipe development set her apart from her contemporaries, making her uniquely qualified to turn accidents into innovations. By early 1938, Ruth had established herself as more than just a successful innkeeper. She had become a local institution. Her butterscotch cookies were so popular that people would call ahead to make sure she hadn't run out. Her Sunday dinners drew families from 3 counties away, and her reputation for warmth and excellence had spread throughout New England. Ruth had even written and published recipes, sharing some of her techniques with home cooks who wanted to recreate her magic in their own kitchens. Ruth's personality, her training, her approach to cooking, her willingness to experiment, her practical nature, all of these elements were converging toward a moment that would change everything. She had no way of knowing, as she went about her careful routines that year, that her methodical nature and willingness to adapt would soon collide with circumstance in the most delicious way possible. The woman who would accidentally invent the chocolate chip cookie was perfectly prepared for the task, even though she had no idea what was coming. The afternoon of 1938 that would change American dessert history forever. It started like any other busy day at the Toll House Inn. You can picture the scene. Ruth moving efficiently through her kitchen, checking on the roast in the oven, stirring a pot of soup, mentally calculating how many guests she'd be serving for dinner. The lunch crowd had been larger than expected, travelers taking advantage of the pleasant autumn weather, and now she was running behind on her dessert preparations. Ruth's routine was sacred, especially when it came to her famous butterscotch cookies. She'd promised a table of regular customers that she'd have them ready, warm and soft, paired with her homemade vanilla ice cream. These weren't just any customers, they were the Hartmans from Boston, who drove an hour each way specifically for Ruth's butterscotch cookies. You don't disappoint people like that, not if you want them to keep coming back. She moved to her baking station, gathering the familiar ingredients: butter, brown sugar, flour, eggs, all the components she'd used hundreds of times before. Her hands worked almost automatically, creaming the butter and sugar to just the right consistency, the kind of perfect texture that comes from years of practice and an understanding of how ingredients behave in different weather conditions. But then, as she reached for her supply of baker's chocolate, the kind she always melted and mixed directly into her cookie dough for variety, her hand met empty space. The shelf where she kept her chocolate bars was bare. Not a single square remained. Ruth paused, her efficient rhythm broken for the first time that day, staring at the empty spot where her chocolate should have been. Now, most bakers faced with this situation might have simply made a different type of cookie, or sent someone to the store, or apologized to the customers and promised to make it up to them next time. But Ruth Wakefield wasn't most bakers. Her scientific mind immediately began problem solving, looking for alternatives, searching for a way to salvage her planned dessert without disappointing her guests. Her eyes scanned the pantry, looking for anything chocolate, anything that might work as a substitute. And there, sitting on a high shelf, was a bar of Nestlé semi-sweet chocolate. Now this wasn't baking chocolate. This was eating chocolate, the kind you'd break off squares from and enjoy with a cup of coffee. But Ruth was desperate and creative, and she'd been experimenting with ingredients long enough to know that sometimes the best discoveries come from necessity. She grabbed the chocolate bar and examined it thoughtfully. The texture was different from her usual baking chocolate, harder, more stable. Instead of the soft, meltable consistency she was used to working with, this chocolate had a firmer structure. Most cooks would have tried to melt it down, to replicate their usual method, but Ruth had a different idea. What if, instead of melting the chocolate completely, she just chopped it up? What if she let the pieces stay intact, scattered throughout the cookie dough like little surprise pockets of sweetness? It was unconventional, maybe even risky, but Ruth had built her reputation on being willing to try new things. Honestly, I admire her confidence in that moment, facing a kitchen crisis and deciding to experiment rather than play it safe. She took a sharp knife and began chopping the chocolate bar into small, irregular pieces. Not powder, not melted liquid, but actual chunks of chocolate that would maintain their shape during baking. As she worked, she probably had no idea she was creating what would become the defining characteristic of America's favorite cookie, those little pockets of semi-sweet chocolate that would make each bite a tiny adventure. The chopped chocolate went into her standard butterscotch cookie dough, and Ruth watched with the curiosity of a scientist conducting an experiment. Would the chocolate pieces melt completely? Would they burn? Would they maintain their shape? Would the cookies taste terrible? She had no way of knowing, but she was about to find out. Some culinary researchers argue that Ruth might have been inspired by similar techniques used in European baking, where nuts or dried fruits were commonly folded into cookie dough. Others suggest that the idea of chocolate pieces in cookies might have been tried before, but never with this particular combination of ingredients and technique that would prove so successful. Into the oven went the first batch of Ruth's accidental creation. She set the timer and waited, probably holding her breath a little, wondering if she was about to serve her loyal customers a delicious surprise or a complete disaster. The familiar smells of baking cookies filled the kitchen, but there was something different this time, a richer, more complex aroma as the chocolate pieces heated and softened without completely melting. When the timer rang and Ruth opened the oven door, she discovered something remarkable. The cookies looked perfect, golden brown, slightly soft in the center, with visible pieces of chocolate scattered throughout like little jewels. The chocolate had softened during baking, but maintained its shape, creating pockets of intense sweetness within the familiar butterscotch base. Ruth pulled one cookie from the tray and took a tentative bite. The texture was unlike anything she'd ever created before. The familiar comfort of her butterscotch cookie enhanced by these surprising bursts of chocolate flavor. It was accidentally brilliant. She had stumbled upon something completely new, and she knew it immediately. Within minutes, she was serving these experimental cookies to the Hartmans, probably with a nervous explanation about the substitution. But their reaction, their delight, their immediate request for the recipe, told Ruth everything she needed to know. She had just created something special, something that would change everything. Word of Ruth's accidental creation spread faster than butter on warm toast. Within days, guests at the Toll House Inn were specifically requesting those cookies with the chocolate pieces, and Ruth found herself making batch after batch of what she had started calling her chocolate Krispies. But there was one small problem. She was going through an awful lot of Nestle semi-sweet chocolate bars, and the local grocery stores were starting to notice. Picture the scene at Whitman's Corner Grocery, the owner scratching his head as he looked at his chocolate display. Every week, his entire stock of Nestle semi-sweet bars would disappear, not gradually, but all at once, usually bought by Ruth or someone from the inn. He'd reorder, thinking maybe there was some kind of chocolate shortage, only to watch the same thing happen again the following week. Honestly, the poor man probably thought half the town had developed a sudden obsession with eating chocolate bars. Meanwhile, at the Nestle Company's regional sales office, someone was scratching their head too. Their reports showed a peculiar spike in semi-sweet chocolate sales, but only in one very specific area of Massachusetts. The numbers didn't make sense. This tiny town of Whitman was suddenly consuming more Nestle chocolate than some entire cities. When patterns like this emerge in sales data, smart companies investigate. A Nestle sales representative, a sharp young man from their regional office, decided to make the drive to Massachusetts to figure out what was happening to all their chocolate. You can imagine his surprise when he arrived at the Toll House Inn in late 1938, expecting to find some kind of candy-making operation or chocolate reseller, only to discover a charming roadside inn where a pleasant woman was chopping up his company's chocolate bars and baking them into cookies. Ruth welcomed the representative warmly, as she did all her guests, and naturally offered him some of her famous new cookies. One bite was all it took. He immediately understood what he was tasting, and more importantly, what it represented. This wasn't just a good cookie. This was a completely new category of dessert, something that had never existed before, and it was driving chocolate sales through the roof in ways nobody had anticipated. The conversation that followed would change both their lives. The representative explained the mysterious sales spike. Ruth shared her accidental discovery, and together they began to see the possibilities. What if this could be more than just a local specialty? What if home bakers across America could make these cookies? What if Nestlé could help make that happen? But there was a practical problem. Ruth's method, chopping chocolate bars by hand, was labor-intensive and inconsistent. Some pieces were large, some small. Some got chopped too fine and melted completely. Others stayed too chunky and fell out of the cookies. For this to work on a larger scale, they needed a better solution, something more reliable and consistent. He brought Ruth's story back to his company, along with samples of her cookies, and the response was immediate enthusiasm. Here was an opportunity that nobody had seen coming, a chance to create an entirely new product category while helping an innovative cook share her accidental discovery with the world. Nestlé's food scientists went to work, developing special chocolate pieces designed specifically for baking. These weren't just chopped chocolate bars, they were engineered morsels, uniform in size and formulated to hold their shape in cookie dough, while still providing that perfect burst of chocolate flavor. The development process took months of testing, adjusting the chocolate formula, perfecting the size and shape, ensuring consistent results for home bakers. Meanwhile, the Nestlé representative negotiated a partnership agreement with Ruth that was unprecedented in the food industry. This wasn't a simple licensing deal. It was something more personal, more collaborative. Ruth would share her recipe, and Nestlé would help her reach home bakers across the country by printing her instructions right on their packaging. Some business historians suggest this was one of the earliest examples of what we'd now call authentic marketing, using a real person's genuine story to sell a product rather than relying on invented characters or exaggerated claims. Others argue it was simply smart business, recognizing that Ruth's credibility as an actual innkeeper and cookbook author would resonate with home bakers in ways that corporate messaging never could. The negotiations were surprisingly straightforward. Ruth wasn't looking to get rich from her accident. She was more interested in sharing something wonderful with as many people as possible. The deal they struck reflected her generous spirit. Nestlé would print Ruth's recipe on every package of their new chocolate morsels, and in exchange, Ruth would receive a lifetime supply of chocolate, a modest payment, and the satisfaction of knowing her accidental creation would bring joy to kitchens across America. By 1939, Nestlé had perfected their semi-sweet chocolate morsels and was ready to launch them nationally. The first packages hit store shelves with Ruth's original recipe printed right on the yellow bag, along with the story of how these cookies came to be created at the Toll House Inn. The marketing was brilliant in its honesty. Instead of trying to hide the accidental nature of the discovery, Nestlé embraced it. The packaging told the real story, how a busy innkeeper ran out of chocolate, how she improvised with what she had, how that improvisation created something entirely new. It was authentic, relatable, and it made home bakers feel like they too could create something wonderful in their own kitchens. The recipe itself was printed exactly as Ruth had perfected it, reflecting her scientific approach to baking while remaining accessible to any home cook. What made this partnership so successful wasn't just the product, it was the story behind it. Here was proof that the best discoveries sometimes happen by accident, that innovation doesn't always come from corporate research labs. Sometimes it comes from practical people solving everyday problems in creative ways. Ruth had accomplished something remarkable. She had turned a kitchen accident into a business phenomenon while maintaining the same warmth and authenticity that had made her infamous. The response from home bakers was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured into both the Toll House Inn and Nestlé headquarters, people sharing their own variations, asking for baking tips, expressing gratitude for a recipe that was quickly becoming a staple in American kitchens. Ruth's accident was about to become America's obsession. As Ruth's chocolate chip cookies began appearing in kitchens beyond Massachusetts, a delightful problem emerged. Everyone wanted the recipe, but not everyone was quite sure how to ask for it properly. Letters began arriving at the Toll House Inn from across New England, some formal, some charmingly awkward, all asking the same question. Could Ruth please share her secret for those wonderful cookies with the chocolate pieces? Ruth found herself in the unexpected position of being America's most requested recipe correspondent. Her mailbox, once filled with routine and business, now overflowed with handwritten notes from home bakers. A grandmother in Vermont wrote that her grandchildren had tasted the cookies at a neighbor's house and wouldn't stop asking for them. A young bride in Maine confessed she'd tried to recreate them from memory, but couldn't get the texture right. A church group in New Hampshire wanted to make them for their annual bake sale. The sweet irony wasn't lost on Ruth. Here she was, famous for a recipe she'd never intended to create, spending hours each week writing out instructions for something that had happened completely by accident. She approached this correspondence with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, making sure each person received not just the recipe, but detailed tips for success. What made Ruth's responses special was how personal they were. She didn't just send a standard recipe card. She wrote actual letters. To the nervous young bride, she included extra notes about proper mixing techniques. To the church group, she suggested ways to make larger batches efficiently. To the grandmother, she shared stories about her own grandchildren's reactions to the cookies. Each letter reflected Ruth's genuine desire to help people succeed in their own kitchens. But as word spread, the volume of requests became overwhelming. Ruth was spending more time writing recipe letters than running her inn. Kenneth, watching his wife struggle to keep up, suggested they find a more efficient solution. What if they could get the recipe published somewhere that everyone could access it? What if newspapers or magazines would print it? The first major publication to feature Ruth's recipe was Better Homes and Gardens in 1940. The magazine's food editor had heard about the cookies through the network of home economists, many of whom had studied at the same colleges as Ruth. The article wasn't just a recipe. It was a full-feature story about the Toll House Inn, complete with photographs of Ruth in her kitchen and descriptions of how the accident had happened. The response to the magazine article was immediate and dramatic. Ruth's mailbox, which had been busy before, now required a wheelbarrow to transport from the post office. Letters arrived from California, Texas, Florida, places Ruth had never imagined her cookies would travel. Home bakers shared their own variations, their families' reactions, their questions about technique. Some food historians argue that this marked the beginning of America's first viral recipe, spreading through a combination of magazine features, word-of-mouth recommendations, and personal correspondence long before social media made such phenomena common. Others suggest that the cookie's popularity reflected deeper changes in American home baking, as more families had access to ingredients like semi-sweet chocolate and standardized measuring tools. Radio shows began featuring Ruth's story, with local cooking programs inviting listeners to send in their own chocolate chip cookie experiences. The recipe appeared in community cookbooks, church newsletters, and school fundraising publications. Each appearance credited Ruth and the Toll House Inn, creating a growing network of recognition that extended far beyond Massachusetts. What I find remarkable about this period is how graciously Ruth handled her sudden fame. She could have become protective of her creation, could have tried to restrict its use, could have demanded payment from every publication that printed it. Instead, she embraced the role of cookie ambassador, genuinely delighted that her accident was bringing joy to kitchens across America. The partnership with Nestlé helped manage some of the overwhelming demand for the recipe. When the chocolate morsels hit store shelves nationally in 1940, complete with Ruth's instructions printed on every package, it meant that anyone who wanted to make the cookies could find the recipe right in their grocery store. The yellow bags became like portable recipe cards, carried from kitchen to kitchen, shared between neighbors, passed along to friends. Ruth began receiving letters from professional bakers too, restaurant owners who wanted to add the cookies to their menus, bakery owners curious about commercial production techniques, food manufacturers interested in creating their own versions. She responded to these inquiries with the same generous spirit, sharing not just the recipe, but insights about what made the cookies special. The flood of correspondence revealed something beautiful about American home baking culture in the 1940s. People weren't just looking for recipes, they were looking for connection. They wanted to be part of the story, to feel linked to the woman who had made this wonderful discovery. Ruth's letters created a network of home bakers who felt like they knew each other, even though they might never meet. By late 1940, Ruth Wakefield had become one of America's most beloved food personalities, not through calculated marketing or publicity campaigns, but through simple generosity and genuine enthusiasm for sharing something wonderful. Her accidental creation had sparked a recipe-sharing movement that would influence American home baking for generations. The recipe wars weren't really wars at all. They were love letters, expressions of gratitude, requests for connection from people who had discovered that sometimes the best things in life really do happen by accident. Ruth had given America more than just a cookie recipe. She had given them a story about the joy of culinary serendipity. By 1941, Ruth's chocolate chip cookies had become something no one could have predicted, a genuine cultural phenomenon. What started as an accident in a small Massachusetts and was now being discussed on radio programs, featured in women's magazines, and whispered about in grocery store aisles across America. The cookies had transcended their humble origins, becoming a symbol of American ingenuity and home-baked comfort. The transformation was remarkable to witness. You could walk into any neighborhood grocery store and see evidence of the chocolate chip revolution. Nestlé's yellow bags of chocolate morsels, once an experimental product, now occupied prime shelf space. Store managers reported that the morsels were flying off shelves faster than they could restock them. Women would arrive with handwritten shopping lists, chocolate morsels circled, underlined, starred for emphasis. Radio cooking shows embraced Ruth's story with enthusiasm. Programs like the Betty Crocker Hour and Kitchen Cloche featured segments about the Toll House Inn, often reading listener letters about their own chocolate chip cookie successes and failures. The intimate nature of radio, that sense of a friendly voice speaking directly into your kitchen, made Ruth's story feel personal and accessible to millions of American women. What made the cookies' popularity so enduring wasn't just their taste, it was their story. Here was proof that wonderful things could happen to ordinary people, that innovation didn't require laboratories or advanced degrees, that sometimes the best discoveries came from simply making do with what you had. In Depression-era America, still recovering from economic hardship, this message resonated deeply. Home economics teachers across the country began incorporating Ruth's recipe into their curricula. High school girls learned to make chocolate chip cookies alongside other essential domestic skills, and many of them carried the recipe into their own homes when they married. The cookies became a rite of passage, a symbol of competent homemaking, a bridge between generations of women sharing culinary knowledge. Women's magazines competed to feature new variations on Ruth's original recipe. Good Housekeeping published double chocolate chip cookies with added cocoa powder. Ladies' Home Journal offered chocolate chip drop cookies for busy mothers. McCall's featured party chocolate chippers with nuts and extra vanilla. Each variation credited Ruth as the original innovator, but the creativity of American home bakers was clearly running wild. The cookies began appearing at church socials, school fundraisers, community gatherings, and family celebrations. They were democratic in the best possible way, requiring no special equipment, no exotic ingredients, no advanced techniques. A farm wife in Iowa could make them just as successfully as a city dweller in Chicago. This accessibility, this universality, helps cement their place in American culture. Honestly, I think there's something beautiful about how the cookies connected people across geographic and social divides. A letter to Ruth from a ranch family in Montana described making the cookies during a blizzard, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of mixing, baking, sharing warm cookies with neighbors when the storm passed. A factory worker's wife in Detroit wrote about how the cookies helped her feel more connected to the rural community where she'd grown up. The phenomenon extended beyond individual households. Restaurants began adding chocolate chip cookies to their dessert menus, often with a note crediting the famous Toll House recipe. Bakeries that had initially been skeptical found themselves unable to keep up with customer demand. Even fancy hotels started offering them, recognizing that sometimes what people really want is something that reminds them of home. Some cultural historians argue that the chocolate chip cookie boom reflected deeper changes in American society. The growing influence of brand marketing, the increasing standardization of home cooking, the way mass media could create shared cultural experiences across vast distances. Others suggest it was simpler than that. People just really loved the cookies and wanted to share that joy with others. Ruth continued to receive hundreds of letters each month, and she tried to respond to as many as possible. Her correspondence reveals the personal impact her creation was having. Teachers wrote about using cookie baking projects to engage reluctant students. Mothers shared stories about children who would only eat vegetables if chocolate chip cookies were promised for dessert. Grandmothers described teaching the recipe to grandchildren as a way of passing along family traditions. The Toll House in itself became a pilgrimage destination for food enthusiasts. Travelers would detour for miles just to taste the original cookies at their birthplace, to meet Ruth in person, to see the kitchen where the accident had happened. Ruth graciously welcomed these visitors, often giving impromptu tours, sharing stories about the early days, letting people peek into the very oven where chocolate chip cookies had first emerged. By the end of 1941, Ruth Wakefield had accomplished something unprecedented in American food history. Her accidental creation had become a national obsession. Her personal story had become part of American folklore, and her generous spirit had inspired a generation of home bakers to embrace experimentation and creativity in their own kitchens. The chocolate chip cookie was no longer just a dessert. It was a cultural touchstone, a symbol of American resourcefulness, and proof that sometimes the most wonderful discoveries happen when you least expect them. Ruth's accident had become America's sweetest success story. December 7th, 1941 changed everything for America, including something as simple and sweet as chocolate chip cookies. When Pearl Harbor thrust the nation into World War II, Ruth's accidental creation was about to embark on an unexpected journey overseas, packed in care packages, tucked into soldiers' duffel bags, and baked in makeshift ovens by homesick servicemen who craved a taste of the home they'd left behind. The transformation happened almost immediately. Within weeks of America entering the war, Chocolate chip cookies began appearing in the most unlikely places. Military bases from California to Georgia, ships crossing the Atlantic, airfields in England, remote outposts in the Pacific. Wherever American soldiers went, Ruth's recipe seemed to follow, carried by mothers, girlfriends, wives, and the soldiers themselves who had memorized the ingredients during their last leave home. You have to understand, food was more than sustenance during wartime. It was connection, comfort, a tangible reminder of what the soldiers were fighting to protect. A chocolate chip cookie wasn't just a dessert. It was a small piece of home, wrapped in wax paper, sent across an ocean with all the love a family could fold into a care package. The letters Ruth received during this period took on a different tone. Instead of recipe requests from suburban housewives, she now heard from military wives asking for tips on baking cookies that would survive long shipping times. Mothers wrote asking whether the cookies would stay fresh in tropical climates. Soldiers themselves sent letters from overseas, describing how the familiar taste of chocolate chip cookies could transform a dreary barracks into something that felt almost like home. What made these wartime cookies special wasn't just their taste, it was their resilience. Ruth's original recipe, with its perfect balance of ingredients and sturdy texture, proved remarkably well suited to the challenges of military life. The cookies could withstand being packed tight in metal tins, survive weeks of shipping across rough seas, and still taste like a hug from home when they finally reached their destination. American Red Cross volunteers discovered that chocolate chip cookies were among the most requested items for care packages. The familiar yellow bags of Nestlé morsels became as essential to volunteer baking sessions as flour and sugar. Church groups, women's clubs, and neighborhood committees organized cookie baking marathons, with dozens of volunteers working assembly line style to produce hundreds of dozens for shipment overseas. Military cooks, working with limited ingredients and improvised equipment, learned to adapt Ruth's recipe to whatever they had available. On a destroyer in the Pacific, a cook substituted condensed milk for regular milk and created a chewier version that became legendary among the crew. At an airfield in England, a mess sergeant figured out how to make the cookies using powdered eggs, creating a version that could be mixed and baked entirely from shelf-stable ingredients. Some military historians suggest that chocolate chip cookies became an unofficial symbol of American abundance and optimism during the war. Representing a country wealthy enough to send sweets to its soldiers and confident enough to believe that normal life, complete with homemade cookies, would return. Others argued that the cookies' popularity reflected deeper psychological needs, providing comfort and continuity during a time of unprecedented upheaval. The stories that emerged from overseas were both heartwarming and heartbreaking. A bomber crew in Italy shared a single package of chocolate chip cookies among 12 men, rationing them to make the experience last as long as possible. A field hospital in France used the cookies as therapy, encouraging wounded soldiers to write letters home while nibbling the familiar treats. A submarine crew in the Pacific celebrated Christmas 1943 with chocolate chip cookies baked by the ship's cook using ingredients hoarded from multiple supply runs. Honestly, reading these accounts decades later, it's impossible not to be moved by how something as simple as Ruth's accidental recipe became woven into some of the most significant moments in American history. These weren't just cookies, they were edible letters, sweet reminders that someone back home was thinking about the boys overseas, caring enough to spend precious sugar rations and shipping space on something purely meant to bring joy. The war years also revealed the democratic nature of Ruth's creation. Chocolate chip cookies appeared in officers' quarters and enlisted men's bunkers with equal frequency. They were shared across racial lines in ways that sadly weren't always possible in other areas of military life. A letter from a segregated unit described how chocolate chip cookies from home became the currency of friendship, traded, shared, and used to build bridges between men who might otherwise have remained strangers. By 1945, as the war began winding down, chocolate chip cookies had become permanently embedded in American military culture. Veterans returning home brought with them not just memories of combat, but stories of how Ruth's accidental creation had provided comfort during the darkest moments. The cookies had literally traveled the world, carrying with them a piece of American spirit, a reminder of the sweetness that made life worth defending. The homecoming celebrations that marked the end of the war featured chocolate chip cookies prominently. Victory parties, welcome home dinners, and family reunions all seem to include platters of the familiar treats. For many families, baking chocolate chip cookies together again, without worrying about sugar rationing or shipping deadlines, became a symbol of peace returning to their lives. Ruth's accident had survived its first great test. The cookies that had emerged from a moment of kitchen improvisation had proven themselves capable of providing comfort across oceans, bridging differences between strangers, and carrying the taste of home to the farthest corners of the earth. The war had made chocolate chip cookies more than just an American favorite. It had made them an ambassador of American values, a sweet reminder of what home really means. The post-war boom of the late 1940s brought something Ruth Wakefield could never have imagined when she first chopped up that chocolate bar, the industrialization of her accident. What had begun as a moment of kitchen improvisation was about to become the foundation of a multi-million-dollar industry, complete with factory production lines, scientific research, and marketing campaigns that would carry chocolate chip cookies into every corner of American life. The transformation started quietly, in corporate boardrooms far from the Toll House Inn, where food industry executives looked at the phenomenal success of Nestlé's chocolate morsels and saw opportunity. If people loved making chocolate chip cookies at home, why not make it even easier for them? Why not remove the mixing, the measuring, the uncertainty, and offer them something foolproof? Pillsbury was among the first to recognize the potential. Their research kitchens, staffed by home economists with advanced degrees, began experimenting with pre-made cookie dough. The challenge was enormous. How do you capture the texture and flavor of Ruth's original recipe? Preserve it in a form that can sit on store shelves for weeks and still deliver the satisfaction of homemade cookies. You can picture the scene in those test kitchens. Scientists in white coats treating Ruth's simple recipe like a complex chemical formula. They studied the interaction between butter and sugar, analyzed the role of each ingredient, measured the precise temperature at which chocolate chips would soften but not melt. What had been intuitive knowledge for Ruth became the subject of rigorous scientific investigation. The breakthrough came when Pillsbury's food scientists figured out how to slow down the chemical reactions that would normally cause cookie dough to deteriorate. They developed preservation techniques, adjusted moisture levels, and created packaging that could keep the dough fresh for extended periods. The result was something unprecedented: cookie dough that could be manufactured in factories, shipped across the country, and still produce cookies that tasted remarkably close to Ruth's original. When Pillsbury's refrigerated chocolate chip cookie dough hit supermarket shelves in the late 1940s, it represented a fundamental shift in American home baking. Suddenly, anyone could have fresh chocolate chip cookies in their oven within minutes. No measuring, no mixing, no chance of failure. Just slice, bake, and enjoy. The convenience was revolutionary, and the sales figures proved it. Some food historians argue that this industrialization marked the beginning of the end for traditional home baking, as convenience products gradually replaced the skills and knowledge that previous generations had taken for granted. Others suggest that products like Pillsbury's cookie dough actually democratized baking, making it possible for people with limited time or experience to enjoy homemade treats. Other companies quickly followed Pillsbury's lead. Duncan Hines developed a chocolate chip cookie mix that required only the addition of butter and eggs. Betty Crocker created their own version, complete with a picture of perfect golden cookies on the box. Each company claimed their product would deliver authentic Toll House-style results, though none could officially use Ruth's name without permission from Nestlé. The competition between cookie companies became fierce and increasingly sophisticated. Food scientists experimented with different types of chocolate chips, varying sizes and shapes, different melting points, anything that might give their product an edge. Some companies developed chips that wouldn't melt at all during baking, creating cookies with distinct chocolate pieces. Others created chips that would partially melt, producing a different texture entirely. Honestly, watching this transformation from Ruth's perspective must have been both gratifying and bewildering. Her simple accident had spawned an entire industry, employed thousands of people, and generated millions of dollars in revenue. Yet the cookies emerging from these factories, while delicious in their own right, were inevitably different from what she could create in her own kitchen with fresh ingredients and personal attention. The marketing campaigns for these mass-produced products revealed how deeply chocolate chip cookies had embedded themselves in American culture. Advertisements didn't just sell convenience, they sold nostalgia, family togetherness, the promise of creating cherished memories. The cookies had become symbols of maternal love, childhood comfort, and home itself. Ruth continued to receive royalties from Nestlé for the use of her recipe, but she watched with mixed feelings as her creation became increasingly commercialized. She appreciated that more families could now enjoy chocolate chip cookies, but she worried that something essential might be lost in the translation from kitchen to factory. The personal touch, the small variations that made each batch unique, the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands, these elements couldn't be mass-produced. The industrialization also led to innovations that Ruth might never have considered. Companies developed chocolate chip cookie ice cream, chocolate chip cookie cereal, even chocolate chip cookie flavored milk. The basic combination of cookie dough and chocolate pieces became a flavor profile that could be applied to almost any food product. By the early 1950s, barely more than a decade after Ruth's original accident, chocolate chip cookies had become one of America's most manufactured foods. Factory production lines could produce thousands of cookies per hour. Quality control systems ensured consistent results, and distribution networks carried the products to every state in the Union. Ruth's kitchen experiment had become an industrial revolution. Yet, something beautiful persisted through all this mechanization. Home bakers continued to make chocolate chip cookies from scratch, passing down Ruth's recipe through families, teaching children the satisfaction of measuring and mixing and waiting for the timer to ring. The mass-produced versions, convenient as they were, couldn't entirely replace the magic of creating something wonderful with your own hands. The industry that grew around Ruth's accident had taken her simple discovery and amplified it beyond anything she could have imagined. But at its heart, whether made in a factory or a home kitchen, every chocolate chip cookie still carried the echo of that moment in 1938 when a practical woman solved a simple problem in the most delicious way possible. While factories churned out millions of chocolate chip cookies, scientists in food laboratories were asking a fascinating question. Why did Ruth's accident work so well? What was happening at the molecular level that made her improvised combination of ingredients so perfectly delicious? The answer, it turns out, lay in a beautiful dance of chemistry that Ruth had stumbled upon without realizing the elegant science behind her discovery. Picture a food scientist in the 1950s peering through a microscope at a cross-section of a chocolate chip cookie, trying to understand what made it so irresistible. What they discovered was that Ruth's accident had created something unique in the world of baking, a dessert where two different textures and flavors coexisted in perfect harmony, neither overwhelming the other, each enhancing the experience of the whole. The secret began with Ruth's choice to chop rather than melt her chocolate. When chocolate is melted and mixed into cookie dough, it disperses completely, creating a uniformly chocolate-flavored cookie. But when chocolate remains in solid pieces, something much more interesting happens. The pieces retain their distinct identity, creating pockets of intense chocolate flavor surrounded by the milder, more complex taste of the cookie dough itself. During baking, the chocolate pieces undergo a carefully orchestrated transformation. They soften just enough to become pleasantly gooey, but they don't melt completely. This happens because the melting point of semi-sweet chocolate, around 86 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, is lower than the temperature needed to properly bake cookie dough. But the chocolate pieces are protected by the surrounding dough, which acts like insulation, preventing them from reaching full melting temperature. You can imagine the delight of food chemists when they realized what Ruth had accidentally discovered. She had created a dessert with built-in textural contrast. Every bite delivered multiple sensations: the slight crunch of the cookie exterior, the chewy softness of the interior, and the smooth, creamy burst of semi-melted chocolate. It was like eating 3 different treats simultaneously, all perfectly balanced and complementary. The chemistry gets even more interesting when you consider what happens to flavor compounds during baking. The Maillard reaction, the complex chemical process that creates the golden brown color and nutty flavor in baked goods, proceeds differently in different parts of the cookie. Around the chocolate pieces, where moisture and temperature vary slightly, unique flavor compounds develop that don't exist anywhere else in the cookie. Some food scientists argue that Ruth's accidental discovery represents a perfect example of what they call flavor layering, creating multiple taste experiences within a single food item. Others suggest that the success of chocolate chip cookies demonstrates the importance of textural variety in creating satisfying desserts. The way different sensations can work together to create something more appealing than any single element alone. What made Ruth's specific combination so successful was the type of chocolate she happened to use. Semi-sweet chocolate, with its balance of cocoa solids, sugar, and cocoa butter, had exactly the right properties for her accidental technique. Milk chocolate would have been too sweet, creating an unbalanced flavor profile. Dark chocolate might have been too bitter, overwhelming the subtle flavors of the cookie dough. Semi-sweet was accidentally perfect. The butter in Ruth's recipe played a crucial role too. As it melted during baking, it created tiny air pockets throughout the dough, giving the cookies their characteristic tender texture. But around the chocolate pieces, the butter behaved differently, creating small zones of enhanced richness that complemented the chocolate perfectly. Ruth had unknowingly orchestrated a symphony of fat, sugar, and cocoa, each element enhancing the others. Temperature control, something Ruth managed intuitively through experience, turned out to be critical to the cookie's success. Too hot, and the chocolate would melt completely, losing that perfect textural contrast. Too cool, and the dough wouldn't develop the proper texture and flavor. Ruth's oven, her timing, her understanding of doneness, all contributed to creating the optimal conditions for her accidental chemistry experiment. Honestly, learning about all this scientific complexity makes Ruth's original discovery even more remarkable. She couldn't have known about Maillard reactions or melting points or molecular interactions, but her practical experience, her willingness to experiment, and perhaps a bit of luck led her to create something that food scientists would later recognize as nearly perfect from a technical standpoint. Modern food technology has allowed scientists to refine Ruth's accident even further. Today's chocolate chips are engineered specifically for baking, with controlled melting points, optimal size and shape, and precise sugar content. They're designed to behave exactly the way Ruth's chopped chocolate bar happened to behave, but with scientific precision rather than happy accident. Yet despite all this technical understanding, despite decades of research and refinement, the essential magic of Ruth's discovery remains unchanged. The chemistry explains why chocolate chip cookies work so well, but it doesn't diminish the wonder of that moment in 1938 when a practical woman solved a simple problem and accidentally created something that would delight millions of people for generations to come. The science behind chocolate chip cookies reveals something beautiful about the nature of culinary innovation. Sometimes the best discoveries aren't the result of careful planning or extensive research. They emerge from the intersection of necessity, creativity, and pure chance. Guided by the intuitive wisdom of someone who understands ingredients well enough to trust their instincts when faced with the unexpected, Ruth's accident had created not just a delicious cookie, but a perfect little lesson in food chemistry, wrapped up in a treat so appealing that most people never stopped to wonder why it worked so well. The science was fascinating, but the magic, the pure joy of that first bite, remained beautifully, mysteriously, deliciously simple. Nearly 90 years have passed since Ruth Wakefield reached for that chocolate bar and found an empty shelf. Yet her accident continues to shape American life in ways both profound and delightfully ordinary. Walk into any kitchen today, open any cookbook, visit any coffee shop or school cafeteria, and you'll find evidence of that moment in 1938 when practical necessity created something timeless. The numbers alone tell an extraordinary story. Americans now consume countless chocolate chip cookies each year, with estimates suggesting billions of cookies disappearing into lunchboxes, office break rooms, and late-night snacking sessions. The sheer volume would be staggering, a delicious reminder of how one woman's accident became a national obsession. Ruth's kitchen accident has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, employing countless bakers, inspiring endless variations, and bringing joy to millions of families. But the true legacy of Ruth's discovery goes far beyond statistics. Chocolate chip cookies have become woven into the fabric of American childhood, the reward for a good report card, the comfort food during illness, the centerpiece of countless birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings. They represent something essential about American culture, the belief that wonderful things can emerge from simple ingredients, that innovation often comes from practical problem solving, that the best discoveries are meant to be shared. You can see Ruth's influence in every variation that followed her original recipe. Oatmeal chocolate chip cookies, double chocolate chip cookies, white chocolate chip cookies, chocolate chip muffins, chocolate chip pancakes, even chocolate chip pizza. Each adaptation pays homage to her original insight, that chocolate pieces distributed throughout a sweet base create something magical, something greater than the sum of its parts. The cookie has transcended its American origins to become a global phenomenon. Bakeries in Tokyo serve chocolate chip cookies alongside traditional Japanese sweets. Cafes in Paris offer their interpretation of Les cookies américains. Street vendors in Mumbai sell chocolate chip cookies from pushcarts. Ruth's accident has become an ambassador of American culture, carrying with it stories of innovation, generosity, and the democratic nature of good food. What strikes me as particularly beautiful about this legacy is how it reflects Ruth's own character. She never sought to hoard her discovery, never tried to prevent others from improving upon it, never claimed more credit than she deserved. Her generous spirit, her willingness to share knowledge, her genuine delight in other people's success, these qualities became embedded in the culture surrounding her creation. Some cultural historians argue that chocolate chip cookies represent the best of American innovation, the ability to take something simple and make it extraordinary, the willingness to embrace happy accidents and turn them into lasting improvements. Others suggest that the cookie's enduring popularity reflects deeper human needs for comfort, for sweetness, for the simple pleasure of something handmade in an increasingly mechanized world. The toll house in itself is gone now, demolished in 1984 to make way for a highway expansion, but a plaque marks the spot where Ruth made her famous discovery. Visitors still stop there, taking photos, sharing stories, leaving small offerings of chocolate chips in tribute to the woman who changed dessert forever. It's a pilgrimage site for food lovers, a reminder that great innovations can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. Ruth lived to see her accident become an American institution. She passed away in 1977 at the age of 73, still receiving letters from grateful bakers, still sharing recipes with anyone who asked, still amazed that her moment of kitchen improvisation had touched so many lives. In her later interviews, she often expressed wonder at the journey her cookies had taken, from a single inn in Massachusetts to kitchens around the world. The recipe itself has remained remarkably unchanged. Despite decades of food science research, despite countless attempts to improve upon Ruth's original formula, most bakers still return to her basic combination of ingredients and technique. There's something profound in that consistency, evidence that Ruth's practical wisdom, her intuitive understanding of what worked, created something so fundamentally correct that it needed no improvement. Today's children learning to bake almost inevitably start with chocolate chip cookies, just as their parents did and their grandparents before them. The recipe serves as a gateway to cooking, teaching basic skills, building confidence, creating positive associations with the kitchen. Ruth's accident has become a rite of passage, a shared experience that connects generations of American families. Perhaps most remarkably, chocolate chip cookies continue to surprise and delight, even after billions have been baked and consumed. There's still magic in that moment when the timer rings, when you open the oven door, when the smell of fresh cookies fills the kitchen. That simple pleasure, that connection between effort and reward, remains as powerful today as it was when Ruth first tasted her accidental creation. The legacy of a happy accident reminds us that the best discoveries often come when we least expect them, that innovation doesn't always require laboratories or advanced degrees, that sometimes the most wonderful things emerge from simply making do with what we have. Ruth Wakefield, reaching for chocolate that wasn't there, created something that would outlast buildings, outlast businesses, outlast even her own lifetime, proving that the sweetest discoveries are the ones we never meant to make. And so, as we reach the end of this sweet journey through time, you can almost smell the lingering aroma of those first chocolate chip cookies drifting from Ruth's kitchen at the Toll House Inn, carrying with them the essence of accidental discovery, the warmth of shared generosity, and the simple truth that wonderful things often emerge when we least expect them. Picture that moment again. Ruth standing in her kitchen, reaching for chocolate that wasn't there, faced with a choice between disappointment and improvisation. In that instant, she chose creativity over convenience, experimentation over explanation, and in doing so, she gave the world something that would bring joy to countless kitchens, countless families, countless quiet afternoons when the smell of baking cookies transforms a house into a home. There's something deeply comforting about Ruth's story, isn't there? In a world that often feels complicated, rushed, unpredictable, her accidental discovery reminds us that the most meaningful innovations sometimes spring from the simplest circumstances. A missing ingredient, a practical solution, a willingness to try something new, and suddenly, magic happens. As you settle deeper into your pillows tonight, let your mind wander back to your own kitchen, to the cookies you've baked, the recipes you've shared, the moments when something unexpected turned into something wonderful. Perhaps you can almost taste that perfect combination, the tender sweetness of cookie dough, the rich surprise of chocolate, the satisfaction of creating something delicious with your own hands. Ruth's legacy lives on, not just in the billions of cookies consumed each year, but in the spirit of generous experimentation she embodied. Every time someone tries a new recipe, shares a family tradition, or stumbles upon an accidental improvement, they're following in her footsteps, proving that innovation doesn't require grand laboratories or complex theories. Sometimes it just requires an open mind and a willingness to make the best of what you have. The night grows quieter now, and your breathing naturally slows, matching the gentle rhythm of the story about sweetness discovered by chance. Let your thoughts drift like the aroma of fresh cookies, soft and warm, carrying you toward rest, toward dreams perhaps flavored with chocolate and comfort, with the knowledge that tomorrow, somewhere, someone will discover their own happy accident, their own small miracle born of necessity and creativity. Close your eyes and feel the peace that comes from stories well told, from lives well lived, from accidents that turn into gifts for the world. Ruth Wakefield, reaching across the decades, offers you this gentle reminder that the sweetest discoveries often happen when we simply do our best with whatever we have, trusting that good intentions, practical wisdom, and a little bit of luck can create something truly wonderful. The timer has rung, the story is complete, and the cookies, metaphorically speaking, are perfectly golden, ready to nourish your dreams as you drift into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that comes after a tale of accidental magic shared across time, from one kitchen to countless others, carrying sweetness, carrying comfort, carrying you gently into rest